Next up is Pierre-Marie Pedro. So last year at ESOP, he presented, I think, a way to add exceptions to COC. And this year he will tell us how we can reason about terms with exceptions.
Oops. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's better. So this is joint work with Nicolas Tabarot, Hans Verman, and Eric Panter. To start with, I would like to recall what we're going to talk about in this presentation. That is about CIC. So CIC is the famous calculus of inductive constructions, and depending on your background, there are virtually two ways to see it. So either as an intuitionistic logical system that has a lot of rich reasoning principles that allows to prove a very, very complex results, or if you're more of a computer scientist, then you can also see it as a powerful functional programming language that has rich dependent types allowing to finally capture the behaviors of your program and actually produce proof-carrying code somehow. So this is the reason why I call CIC the pinnacle of the Curry-Howard correspondence, and if this didn't make any sense at all, then just figure it out as being COC, right? This is the system that is underlying the COC implementation. All right, so I just said that CIC was a very powerful functional programming language. Well, that's true as long as you can tolerate the fact that you're living in a purely functional fantasyland. So the reason is that COC is utterly pure. So it's even purer than Haskell, that is a well-known impure language because it has non-termination. So you don't have that in COC. And worse than that, in languages like Haskell, you can actually rely on the monadic style to embed effects in this pure, or kind of pure system. But here, because you have dependent types, then you get into strange situations. So you've seen this morning the way to reason about effects in this setting. But this does not really scale to the full power of dependent types if you try to really take the most of their power. And in that case, you could actually legitimately wonder why you're going to use COC in the first place when you could do something that is less expressive. So the conclusion is somehow that CIC is not a very interesting, effectful programming language, which, depending on what you believe, could be a rather good thing. Thankfully, we've been solving this problem, or at least trying to solve it before. Essentially, there are two reasons why you would do that. So, as I said, you can use it to program more, but also due to the Curry-Howard correspondence, you can also do that to get more new reasoning principles. There is a lot of things to say about that, but unfortunately, I don't have time at all to talk about this. But you can read everything we've written so far. And all those models are given by means of a very richly typed compilation process, which I'm going to come back about soon. So there is only one very simple effect I will be talking about today, and these effects are exceptions. All right, so background, we gave an extension of CIC to exceptions last year, and you can picture it that way. This is really just COC together with the failure mechanism, which is called by name, so this is a bit strange if you're used to usual exceptions. And I insist on the fact that this is really the whole of CIC, so the incredibly dependent stuff just goes through. You interpret all of CIC. And the good thing is that this is compiled away by means of a mere program translation to the usual COC implementation. So that's what we call syntactic models. So let's have a look at what it looks like. So essentially, you get a new primitive that is raise of type for all AA, and the semantics of that new primitive is that if you raise at a function type, you just do the lambda thing, so you're just taking the argument and re-raising on the codomain. And if you're raising over match, then it's going to escape by re-raising, right? So this is really just escaping the current call by name context. And contrarily to what you would do in simpler settings, call by value in the call by value setting, you can only catch exceptions on inductive types, but you can do so by means of a generalized elimination or dependent elimination principle. So I recall that the dependent elimination principle for Booleans is that thing that says that if you want to show that a property P holds for all Booleans, you only have to prove this for true and false, and then you get the expected reduction rules, like this thing applied to true reduces to the first branch, and same thing to the second branch, and false. And the in presence of exceptions, you get a generalization of that, where in addition to the two branches, you have the case to handle raise, right? So this is really just saying that catching exceptions is a very similar to matching inductive types, like as if in OCaml you would be using the exception pattern. And this satisfies the expected rules. And I would like to advocate here that even though exceptions are utterly stupid as an effect and very simple to explain, then they are quite useful. So for instance, a practical thing you could do in Coq is like, oh yeah, you know you have dead code in your program, and you know that a branch you don't have to do anything here. But Coq forces you to actually provide a proof that this branch is dead, and you have to struggle like crazy in order to convince it that this is correct. So what do you do with exceptions? You just raise. A small variant of that is that when you start doing that, you actually don't even need to add hypotheses to your functions. You can just dynamically check that you're in the right case, and if ever things are not right, then you can just use the exception to raise and escape. So you don't have to thread the logic everywhere. You can cleanly separate the computational content of your programs compared to their proofs, right? And another thing that happens often is that that's like the how would you call that? The archetypical example of dependent types, like the head function. If you want to write head on lists, then you have to do either you either have to return an option, or you have to find some default value for your type, which is kind of cumbersome. In presence of exceptions, you don't have to make any such design choice. You just say, okay, raise the exception and be done with it. And this is actually something that happens in the wild quite a lot of times, like people in MathConf, HS Coq. This is not something I made up on that slide, right? So there is a slight problem though. So I gave you the rules for the exceptional type theory, but what is the reason you should trust this type theory? It could be completely like made up and broken. Actually, we have a very simple way to do that. This is providing a model, and we've been advocating for quite a long time already for so-called syntactic models. So I don't have time at all to describe precisely what happens. But the idea is the following. You see your extension of type theory as some kind of a more powerful variant, higher level construct, say, and you compile syntactically this new system into the usual, or say a lower level like CIC system, right? So you just keep extending the system like an onion by providing a syntactic translation at every step. This leads to the slogan that CIC is definitely the LLVM of type theory. All right. And what is the justification for the exceptional models? That's quite easy. Very briefly, the idea is that a type in the exceptional type theory is not just a type, it's a type together with an inhabitant. So types are now pointed types, right? Every time you get a type, you also get a default inhabitant for that type. And a term of some type A is just a term of the underlying type. Okay, easy. So yeah, the idea is that you carry the failure at the type is given to you by that very type. So how does it look like? Obviously, you translate. This is just the syntactic explanation of what I just described before. So types are just pointed types. So it's a pair of a type and inhabitant. Functions are interestingly just functions as far as their underlying type is concerned. So you just do that functorially. And we have to provide a default value for the thing. So I'm not giving you the type one because it depends on the model and it's a bit complex. But for the function, how do you raise an exception at a function? Just look at what I described before. That is, you take the argument and you re-raise in the codomain, right? So this is exactly what that thing is doing. The default function is just a function that returns the default codomain. And once you did that, then actually raising is just using that information that is carried over by the type, and you don't have anything special to do. So that's a very simple model. That is an instance of a more complex one that we describe in another paper. And I didn't describe, obviously, the case for inductive types, which is where things go completely wrong. But there is a way to do that and to get a full model of CIC. And the idea is essentially to add, for every inductive type, you add a new case that is going to be the error case. So for instance, for Booleans, you say that you've got the true, false, and a new error case. And then how do you translate dependent elimination? That's pretty easy. You just do it the very same way. So now the translation. So the translation here below is the translation of the unfolded translation of the dependent elimination principle. And you have to prove P of B given P of true and P of false. So there are now three cases because B can be either is a free valued inductive. So if it's true, you can use P of true, you're fine. If it's false, you can use P of false, you're fine. And if it's an error, you're lacking any hypothesis to do that. But thankfully, because every type is inhabited, you can use P of B there, the error type, the error value at P of B, to re-erase the exception. So pattern matching an exception is literally re-erasing the exception, nothing else. That's pretty easy. So obviously, we contain all of CICs. You can show that easily. But because we have exceptions, by the very definition of exceptions, you recover an inconsistent system. Obviously, just use the exception to escape, and then you prove false immediately. It can be solved by just shifting your point of view. You could claim that essentially usual programming languages are definitely inconsistent as a logic, because you have effects indeed. And if you just say that the exceptional type theory is no more a reasoning system, but rather a programming language, then you solve the problem. A dependently type programming language. And everything is not lost in the sense that if you have a proof of false, then you can show that the only way to do that is to raise an exception. So that's what we call like progress in the programming language community, but it's a form of canonicity as well. We also gave in that paper from last year a restriction to that theory that is consistent. Essentially, it relies on parametricity to rule out the wild behaviors of exceptions. So you locally guarantee that no exceptions can escape at top level. So this is kind of strange. And the thing you get is like this theory is logically weaker than the exceptional type theory. Thankfully, it's consistent, and it's also strictly bigger than CIC. But now we've got a dilemma, right? Because we have two systems. So either you use the exceptional type theory, which is logically inconsistent, and you cannot do a lot of logic there, but you can use it for programming, because that's great. Or you use the parametric restriction of it, and then in that case, you're actually consistent, but you cannot really use the exceptions anymore. So this is kind of a bummer, right? So in this paper, we solved the solution very elegantly by providing a new type theory, which is the reasonably exceptional type theory, which is 3-in-1. So how does it work? You have not one, not two, but three universe hierarchies. So the first one is called the pure layer. So it's type P, which corresponds to an embedding of CIC in your theory. So you get, with that thing, you get a consistent system that is completely pure, so no exception nor anything. That you can use for proving. You have the exceptional layer that is inconsistent. So it corresponds to the exceptional type theory. You can use it for full exception in programming. And there is a third universe system that is the mediating layer, which corresponds to the parametric type theory that is consistent but has still some kind of local exception that can be used to make them cohabitate. So if you take them in isolation, then every hierarchy is a variant of CIC, right? So the motto is you should write all your programs in the exceptional hierarchy and prove them either in the mediating or the pure hierarchy. Obviously, the interesting thing is the boundary of those hierarchies. So how do you make them interact? If you can build function, and the function lives in the hierarchy of its codomain, right? So that allows you to quantify over things that live somewhere else, but you live in the codomain, okay? The even more interesting things that happens is the elimination of inductive types. So in CIC you have recursors, and in XCT you have a catch. Now we have the inductive types can live in one hierarchy and the predicate in another hierarchy. And then, depending on the precise couple you take, then you get a different possibility of doing something. So the diagonal is just the isolation, so it's not very important. But the interesting thing to remark is that when you want to go from the exceptional hierarchy to any other hierarchy, then you have to guarantee that no exception escape. So this is essentially saying that you have to catch everything at the boundary of the hierarchy. And this is somehow some variant, or in spirit, a variant of the singleton elimination of CIC. We have a lot more stuff in the paper that I don't have time to describe. So we've got modalities, which is probably the reason I was put in this session for some reason. And a way to capture internally using the mediating layer the fact that an exceptional type is an exceptional term is actually exception-free. And this is the main reason why we have this complex mediating layer. And yeah, really, I don't have a lot of time. We implemented, so because the reasonably exceptional type theory is actually a program translation, then it's very easy to provide it as an extension of Coq. Just write the compilation scheme as a plugin, and that will generate on-the-fly terms from the source theory, and it will just output horribly unreadable terms in Coq that type checks by miracle. That miracle is called the soundness theorem. And I'm not very happy about it, but because we don't have this different system of hierarchies in Coq, then we relied on the prop type separation. So prop corresponds to a pure layer, and type corresponds to the exceptional layer. This is very, very hackish, so it doesn't work on the side. You shouldn't look too much at it, but you can try. At least you can prototype and try to do the thing. So one of the questions that might be interesting to ask is whether this might be implemented directly inside Coq, so that you don't have to rely on this on-the-fly compilation. So that's one of the things we could do. One of the potential things we can showing that actually this kind of extended effectful type theory can be in practice useful for programming. So I don't know whether it's an attempt, but I have no actual proof that we can write programs. There is a clear application that is gradual typing. So by combining this kind of theory with other translations of ours that essentially is giving you the power of dynamic types in Coq, you can actually embed the system that was defined last Monday, because the why not type is essentially behaving as an exception, so you can reuse the very same translation to obtain something similar. And more generally, all the work we've been doing so far with a lot of different effects could go in CIC by saying that for every single effect, you could create a fresh new hierarchy and define their potential interactions with the different effects. So instead of having this kind of, it's a kind of dependently typed type and effect system where the effect is tracked by the hierarchy you're living in. So this is the omega in one type theory. So all right, so I'm just concluding. So we're defining the reasonably exceptional type theory, which is 3 in 1. So you get an inconsistent system that is used for programming, a consistent logic that you can use to reason about those effectful types, and another consistent system that you can use to mediate between both of them. So everything interacts together very smoothly. This is compiled away to normal type theory, and this is also implemented in your favorite proof assistant, which is undoubtedly Coq. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pierre-Marie. So, of course, you can ask questions through Slido. So let me start with a question from there. So, Anonymous is asking that Tony Hoare called null pointers a $1 billion mistake. So are lazy exceptions not the same?
Probably, but how to answer that? It depends on your particular set of beliefs, but at least here you're not forced to stick to the $1 million mistake. Or billion? Is it a billion or a million? Billion, probably. Yeah.
Okay, another anonymous question is asking what kind of proofs about exceptional programs have you carried out using RETT? Is this just like small examples?
So these are rather small examples that are mostly proof of concept. But the examples the concepts I gave in one slide show that they are pretty common in the wild, and that we've got a lot of potential users already. Like that would be trivial to solve using this kind of technology.
So we have a question there.
So I have a couple of questions. It sounds actually, it's a really nice talk. It's a really nice idea. Why would you ever want to put this stuff in the kernel if you can compile it down to CIC?
Thanks a lot for this very interesting question. The problem is that if you do the compilation phase, you lose a bit of the expressivity of the system. That is, for instance, you lose definitional equalities that hold in the theory, because the new terms that appear, they are defined as axiom through the thing. So we just define a correctness inside the system, and you can also prove via the translation that they are propositionally equal to something else, but on the source theory you will not compute. So this can be solved either by using say rewrite rules or the technology that was described by Andre this morning, but we don't have that in Coq, or by having that direct in the kernel.
One other question, actually. Also, in terms of usability, so when you raise an exception, you push it down all the way till the bottom. So how, assuming this will become usable programming, how informative will the error messages be? Or
you mean the type error messages, or the runtime behavior of the function? So.
Good question.
Successful interaction.
So we have two other questions here. So while the microphone is migrated, let me ask one from Srido. So it looks like your model relies on impredicativity, or at least Anonymous thinks so. Is that the case?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So I was slightly surprised by your answer to the previous two question, I guess, about why would you translate? Why would you want it to be in the kernel rather than to translate? Because to me, it seems like an obvious reason would be that there may be performance implications for having a does that make sense? Like, am I?
Definitely, yeah. So if you go directly through the kernel, then that would be better for performance than having to go through generating huge terms that might not be linear in the size of the original proof term. And
also, like, when your exceptions are being manually propagated by your eliminators,
Yep.
Whereas if you actually had, that's not how you actually usually implement exceptions in a practical language. You just jump to some pointer.
No, in any case, we would rely on the machine from the kernel that will do the very same job as what we do at the upper level, but that would be done at the level of the machine of the thing. Like, we don't compile Coq to anything else than a simple machine, at least for the kernel.
So there are still many questions on Slido, so we won't be able to ask all of them. Maybe while Christian sets up, there's time for one more question here.
So, nice talk. This question isn't just for you, but for anybody in the audience who knows the answer. So one thing that one might hope for is an extension of Curry-Howard, so that if you allow non-termination or raising exceptions or what have you, you say, right, you can only trust this proof once you execute it. Right? If you execute it and it doesn't raise an exception, and none of its parts hereditarily raise an exception, then it's true. It's checking this hereditary thing that's difficult. My guess is somebody came up with this idea 30 years ago, but I don't know who or where. So does anybody know?
Like realizability?
Maybe it's related to realizability.
It is. So the parametricity translation corresponds directly to Kreisel's modified realizability. In practical, in PXTT, we prove exactly the principles from Kreisel's modified realizability.
Okay, great. Let me talk to you afterwards. If somebody else has a good answer, please find me.
Yeah, so we don't have time for any further questions, so we have to take those offline.